part of this walkthrough. The walkthrough is conducted in collaboration with Mumbai Gallery Weekend and shall be conducted by Sudhir Patwardhan, that is his retrospective, and curator Nancy Adajania. Nancy, could I please request you and so to you to take us through the show.
Thank you so much. So, NGMA, the Guildart Gallery, Sudhir Patwardhan and I warmly welcome all of you for this walkthrough of Walking Through Soul City, Ek Se Ru Ke Shahar Mein. As my first curatorial gesture, I'd like to propose a form of defamiliarization from everything that we know about Sudhir's works. And the reason why I'm doing this is because on the one hand, we feel that the narrative that we find in Sudhir's paintings is extremely legible, which it is, because the characters in Sudhir's paintings, if you just cross the road, you will find a laborer sipping chai, on a pavement, or you'd find the domestic worker running for a Bombay local. So yes, they are all very familiar to us, many of the characters as well as the narratives. But what happens is that many of these dominant readings of Sudhir's paintings, in a way, they concentrate on making you feel as if Sudhir Patwardhan is the painter of the city, which he is, as I said. But I think that there is something deeper than just merely categorizing him as a painter of the city and its inhabitants. And the reason why I say this is because it can become a reductive interpretation. What happens is that sociologists, urbanists, they start looking at the characters and the content of Sudhir's paintings as evidentiary material to understand the city. And that's where it becomes reductive. And therefore it instrumentalizes his art in the service of this or that academic paradigm. And therefore, I would like to actually propose the distinction that John Berger made between subject and theme. So, Van Gogh, for instance, painted flowers, but that was his subject, that was not his theme. So there are deeper underlying themes to those paintings. In the same way, with Sudhir Patwardhan's works, when you start thinking of not just the subject, but the deeper themes of his work, you think in terms of mortality, you think in terms of time, you think in terms of space as fiction, you think in terms of the relationship of the human being to the collective, of the human being to the cosmos. And when I started thinking about how to curate this show, I knew that I wanted to bring in other ways to read Sudhir's works. And that is why even the title of the show is Walking Through Soul City. Again, with a metaphysical qualifier in it. And what I propose through the curation of this exhibition is also one of my arguments would be that what you see in Sudhir's works is often an interplay between a very palpable materialism and philosophical idealism. And that is what you're going to actually see in many of the works here. It's in a way what is at the heart of his practice. And why Walking Through Soul City? The word soul has been added to the title because, as I said, it is to foreground the metaphysical aspects of Sudhir's works, but it's also because I wanted to propose that there are these philosophical underlying themes in his work which often are not regarded at all. Or if they are, then again they are sort of they are sort of easily written away as something which deals with urban culture. For example, when you on this very level, what we have here is Another Day in the Old City, and maybe Sudhir, you could take us through this painting.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah.
First of all, let me thank Nancy for the lovely way in which she has curated this show, which has brought out many meanings that have added the richness of the readings of the show. Now, this painting is inspired by my childhood in Pune. So, and then of course regular visits to Pune. So, though I am a painter regarding chiefly as in Bombay, This is one exception. And I am interested essentially in the way in which walking through a space creates a certain kind of structure in your mind. Structure in the sense of a certain movement in your mind. And walking through old parts of Pune, where there are roads that lead down to the river and other roads that lead up towards a bridge across the river. So these two elements add a certain kind of perspectival kind of complexity to one's walk, to what one remembers of one's walk. That one remembers that one could have gone down that way, one could have climbed up this way, and that is what builds up in your mind. And of course the texture of the old buildings, the texture of the faded colors, and the texture of the lives of people. So all these add up to, it's called another day in the old city, because it's just another day, and there will be many more. There have been similar before. So there is a kind of nostalgia about that, about old things passing. But I always see nostalgia not as a negative feeling. I always see nostalgia as something to hold on to, because it has some kind of value for us to point ways forward to. So that's my take on, if there's anything you would like to add to that.
No, I mean, that's beautifully put. And the reason also to have this here on this key wall of the first level is because it's also to break this whole cliched understanding of Sudhir's work that he is in a way documenting the reality of urban life. Even if you look at this work, for instance, you're not looking at the artist painting this particular panorama from one single vantage point. As Sudhir pointed out, you could be actually seeing parts of the painting from a lower height. Other parts could be aerial. Yet others could just be perspectival blurs, or they're taking you into a detour into the city. So it's very much like Escher's, paintings, where you'll always have this blurring between inside and outside, confusion between the advancing and the recessive planes. And that's what I also find very fascinating about Sudhir's works, because as I said, it's not just a documentarian eye. In fact, it is space as fiction, as I was calling it, because it's not just creating an illustration of that particular reality. It's mixed with memory, desire, memories of what happened. In fact, I remember Sudhir talking about how, the painting was triggered by his memory of his uncle taking him, on a walk through the city, but on a buffalo. So that's what you also actually sense through the painting. And the idea was to have another day in the old city, but also compass and enigma. As I was talking about earlier in my introduction, how do we in a way highlight the philosophical aspect also to these works? So if you realize that the painting, at the right corner of the wall is called Enigma, and these are all works from the last 2 to 3 years, so they're recent works. And Enigma has a Penrose triangle in it. Sudhir, would you like to talk about this Penrose triangle and why you chose to create this symbol?
I've been kind of intrigued by that. It's a well-known form which Penrose and then MC Escher has used repeatedly to expose, let us say, and to kind of baffle us about representation and reality, or let's say the gap between representation and reality. So these are forms which are entirely convincing, as if they were kind of industrial mathematical drawings of existing three-dimensional forms, engineering forms. But we know that they can't exist. So how come this has happened? I mean, you are convinced that this is something that can be built, but you can't build it. Now, moving from there to the idea that language is always, in this sense, never completely overlapping reality. There's always something in between which is slipping out. So I put the figure in drawings. I was making drawings of this triangle, and then suddenly it occurred to me that I could include a figure in it. And when I included the figure, something else happened. That now, do you believe that that figure could be handling that form. And if not, then you can't believe in the figure either. So the existence of the figure, the existence of form, all become questioned at different levels, and it's all happening because of, in a sense, the way in which language operates. So that's
again beautifully put, Sudhir. So including the figure, actually, as you said in the narrative, means that again we are moving into the space of fiction, because is this an alien or is it a human being? This form itself is a mathematical conundrum, as you said. It's not something that can exist in reality. It is an optical illusion. So that's why at this very first level, we have these works to be able to help you to see Sudhir's works differently, to see them against the current of consensual reading. And even again in Compass, you have the Penrose triangle again there. Again, you have these different planes and reflections merging within the painting, and you have a fetal figure there. Could you talk a little bit about the detail of that fetal figure?
Yeah, that's one of the things that, like when you're actually doing the painting or drawing, something emerges. So that's an example of something emerging. You suddenly feel that this triangle looks like there could be a head here, there could be feet here. And then you think, like, yeah, I mean, getting born. I mean, there's this, Ranjit is here, and there's this beautiful garden. Na hota to kya hota. So, Mustansir is here. So questions like that will pop up into your mind.
Yeah.
So it's
Yes.
vague, but it's like...
Yes. No, it's not vague at all. In fact, I mean, the fetal figure is, again, the sense of, maybe crafting a new consciousness, or a new birth, for instance. So we have these three key works here to introduce you to the show, and then what you have is actually a strapline of early works from Sudhir, which is when Sudhir first comes to Bombay, and he studied at the AFMC in Pune, and while he was studying medicine, he was very interested in art, so he started taking hobby classes at the Abhinav Kala Mandir, and he was also introduced to Marxism around the same time, in the late 60s, early 70s, by his friend Sandeep Pain Singh, who was an activist. And so you have this kind of colonial style pedagogy, you have Marxist activism, all of these different references and sources that feed into his consciousness. So we have the straplines for the early works, and then what we have here, for instance, are two works, Killing and Marchers. And you need to see Killing, Marchers, alongside Accident on May Day and Erase. And we will just take you a little bit through these works. For every level we won't go into each work, but I think because this is the ground level and we'd really like to introduce you to the works, we'll try and take you through some of the narrative as well as the analysis, and then maybe we'll go a little quicker. But while we were putting up these works, actually I decided to put up Killing upstairs. But then one day in the evening when everybody had gone out to have chai and snacks, at that time I just decided to stay alone in the gallery, and I realized that we need to have Killing and Marchers right here at the first level. And when I started looking at Killing again and again, I just realized what an important painting it is. And if you look at Killing, for instance, you do not know, I mean, you of course know who the perpetrator of this crime is. I mean, there is somebody who is trying to hit another person, and there is this kind of stigmata, there is a wound there. But at the same time, you realize that the killer and those who are trying to help the victim, they are all entangled together. And it's almost as if they're all in a group holding on to each other. And that ambiguity of being wounded and holding on to each other, that blur between the killer and the victim, that is what, I mean, that actually really hit me, while we were putting up the works. And I realized that Killing would actually go very well with Marchers, which is a recent work, 2019 work. And again, already we were witness to all the important farmers' rallies by that time. Of course, the protests against the CAA had not started at that time, but the farmers' rallies had been coming to the city, and people within the city were also expressing their solidarity with the farmers who were suffering from drought. So I thought that again, I mean, the idea is, I mean, this is a retrospective, of course, and we are going back into the artist's life, but we are also doing a pass forward, because I mean, how do these works make sense to us today? Therefore, this exhibition does not follow a strict chronology. There is a constant, there's a constant movement between the past and the present. So you have Killing, which again it almost looks like a classical painting. Sudhir, would you like to add something to Killing?
As you said, ambiguity is an important concept, an idea, feeling for me. And so, if I'm painting evil, if I'm painting people who are perpetuating evil, along with that, my feelings for that cannot entirely be negative and can't entirely be a rejection, because somewhere I have to recognize that evil also exists within me, and it has to in some sense be resolved. It has to in some, and therefore this idea of coming together between the victim and the perpetrator of the violence, that they belong to one, let's say, they belong together basically. You cannot separate them, as in fact today, as you are saying, that people are being separated. You can't do that. So that is the reason for the way in which they are bound together in a sense.
And in fact, when I invited Sudhir to write his note for one of the anthologies that I put together, Some Things That Only Art Can Do, I remember the entry for that anthology that he had was Structured Ambivalence. Do you want to say a little bit about structured ambivalence? Because that's also one of the ground notes of how you structure your works.
That's true. I mean, I think art, one of the essential functions of art is to structure ambivalence. And to structure ambivalence means to structure our conflicting feelings for various things in life. So to give form to those conflicting feelings, love and hate, whatever, you hate. One of the examples that I used there was a polluted stream, and I was enjoying the colors in that polluted stream, and I knew that that's a polluted stream which is killing fish. Now what do I do with my feeling that I'm enjoying this color and with my knowledge that this is bad? I have to just hold it together in an image. I have to hold both these things together in an image to be able to convey to all of us that we all carry these conflicts within us, which cannot always be resolved, but which need to be addressed continuously. That's the thing.
Thank you. And now we can see Killing and Marchers alongside Accident on May Day, which is an early work, early 80s, 1981. And then we have a more recent work, Erase. And one of the reasons to have this early work here was because Accident on May Day also, if you can all just come closer. Made in the early 80s. These were some of the breakthrough works of Sudhir's, and alongside Street Play and Train, and before that in 1979, The City. So this is from that constellation of body of works. And I mean, what I've always found fascinating about this work itself, which I've often taught in my Gyanprava classes on art criticism, is that again what you see here is, how he does not use perspective at all. And even when you have a little bit of the landscape, it's actually, the landscape is pulled forward. It's almost like it's merging with the foreground. So again, the way in which he's dealing with space is very interesting. And here you have, of course, a narrative of a wounded worker who's being taken away on a stretcher, and then you have, of course, the communist flag, and you have the policeman's baton. I mean, the policeman's baton is something that we're seeing every day, in these recent weeks. So as a symbol of authority and repression. And again, when you look at this work, most of the figures are grey, and by the time you actually go into the interior of this compartment, the figures are almost start looking abstract. Like it becomes like a mass of faces. And as I said, there is one element of relief. It's a kind of poetic break or caesura, as one way we call it, which is basically a little strip of the sky and the mountain. But otherwise, It's quite claustrophobic. It's exactly the way we feel when we are on the platform for a Bombay local, and the grey pallor of these figures. Sudhir, would you like to talk about the time when you made this work, a memory of making that work?
It was a time when, one knows that in the 70s and through early 80s, workers' movements, morchas, strikes were very common in Bombay. But there was already a feeling that all is not going well for the left movement. All is not going for the trade union movement. And my sense of that was expressed through this bringing together of May Day, which is a celebration of workers' unity, with an accident, with a derailment, sort of. So it brings together some kind of level of doubt, suspicion about where we are headed, where this movement is headed. So that's essentially the kind of reason for,
yes,
the reason behind the work.
So the derailment, again, the sense of doubt, and that's why we have Accident on May Day next to Erase. Now Erase is a work from the last Vadera show, which is very recent. Erase is basically the portrait of the artist in the studio. And what is extremely intriguing about this work is that here you have the artist who's aging, who's vulnerable, but also very melancholic. And he has this dirty rag in his hand, and he's trying to rub something in the air. So basically these are specters or ghosts which he's trying to sort of ward off. And when I look at this work, I've often thought that also it is staged like theatre as well, just as killing is. And it's almost as if there's a fictive fourth wall, and that's basically us, the audience, the viewers. And in some ways, although Sudhir is inviting us to be voyeurs and to look into his studio, he's also in a way, sort of erasing our presence in some sense. I mean, of course, this is my interpretation. Sudhir kind of rejected it immediately, But I find this very interesting, and also the way in which he's dealing with space. As we can see from his very early works, he's not merely recording reality. As I said, he's using space as he's creating space as fiction. So even here, for instance, although of course you can make references to Van Gogh in the studio or Velázquez in the studio, the way, for me this is a very cinematic work as well. It's almost as if the camera is on a trolley and you have a film set and you're moving from one room into another. And therefore, you see all these multiple spaces which suddenly open up, in front of your eyes. And the idea of having Accident on May Day, which, as you correctly pointed out, is a derailment of that particular moment of solidarity or the hope for worker solidarity. So I thought these grey-pallid workers and the grey-pallid artists, and some way it's also a way of thinking about what happened to the revolution. The success and the failure of the revolution. So I thought bringing these two works together would also make us think about. So and again, as I said, we have the strapline, which has basically the early works of Sudhir. So there, of course, I've put Sudhir's I and Akka, his parents, alongside Marx and Gandhi. And the idea was that you look at, where he comes from, his parents, but also his political lineages. Again, it's basically, when you're curating, you also want to find ways in which you can also create your own narratives. There are narratives which are embedded within the painting, which the artist has created. But every act of interpretation also creates a new narrative. So what you are seeing is the narratives of the artist, which are then overlaid by the interpretations of the curator, and then we have interpretations of all of you viewers. So, for example, on my Facebook, every day I have a viewer putting up their perspectives on Sudhir's works, and the way in which they photograph various details of your works, Sudhir, shows me how they are interpreting the show. So that itself becomes so basically a show, a retrospective, is a palimpsest. What you have are layers and layers of interpretation, and that's the most beautiful thing about it. And on this side, what we have here are again his early works, but also maybe should we go a little bit on that side and
73, and I was staying alone there before Shankar joined me. So it was a room like this, and it was like reliving one's readings of Dostoevsky and Camus and Sartre in the big city. Coming from Pune and bang into this metropolis where you're totally unknown, totally an anonymous person on the street, in the trains, walking about, and living this kind of existentialist kind of thing. So this image and the early works were in that expressionist mode where it was about the self, it was about expressing one's own anguish. And I think they have a certain authenticity, but I moved away from that because I felt that this was restricting myself to, because I was seeing so many people, I was looking at people, and that drew me out of myself to start painting people rather than continue to paint myself as such.
And in fact, you often talked about how in those early days, you used to almost have a kind of psychosomatic reaction, because you talked about how when you looked at people who were hurt or maimed on the street, you also felt as if, you felt their pain in your body, and you would feel your own muscles knotting up. So this kind of psychosomatic bonding of the self with the other, and then how do you deal with that? So it's and that's where Sudhir's famous formulation comes up, which is about the near and the far, which is how close should you get to the other, and how far should you be. So you want the disquieting sensorial presence of the other, but you also want a certain amount of distance, because if that distance doesn't exist, then it becomes like this, where the face is an expressionist mirror. And even when you look at this work, first of all, the pink, it reminds me of Bhupen's pink. It's very much that kind of Baroda, middle class, domestic interiors pink. And you also have the mori, which is very interesting, because the mori is, again, a feature of the chal, where it's a space that's carved out in that room, which is basically living room and bedroom, and where you just wash yourself because the toilets are outside. So on the one hand, there are details which you can actually, which urban anthropological details that you can sort of mark out. But on the other hand, suddenly you have this completely distorted body and the face, which is a total blur. And then you have something like this, where you have this woman who's lamenting, and where often people come and ask me, so what is this? And you say, no, it's actually a human being, but they can't figure out the contours, because it's basically a woman who's sitting on her haunches and crying, but you don't see her face, and because of the way in which it is rendered, it just looks like a mass of flesh, like a baconess kind of mass of flesh. And there's one work there which is extremely interesting, right there, which is called the chair, and that again is very, very subtle. And I was also thinking, Sudhir, these were such early days, and yet, early 70s, and you haven't gone to an art academy, and yet, as an autodidact, the way in which you would constantly question your own practice and move ahead, that's something that I've also found very fascinating. That the artist is an autodidact, somebody who self-studies, teaches himself. That chair, for instance, you just have the presence of a foot, which is entangled with one of the legs of the chair. But if you look closely, on the foot there is a spark. And that spark, if you see, it has a little bit of impasto on it. Can you just tell us a little more about it?
It is more, as you said, actually, about the kind of psychosomatic response to things. And then this process of bringing it outward, moving it outward from one's own body. So, as I said, there's a green torso there, which also represents for me a kind of point at which I could finally make an image of another person. And in the chair, it's actually trying to paint an object with which I am entangled, in which my body is entangled, and trying to separate in the sense, trying to move these just away enough so that they have their own existence. So the chair is not distorted. Like, for example, here things all merged into one kind of,
So it's more like objectivity coming.
Yes, there's more objectivity
Yes.
coming, trying to separate it, and the spark is, or the arrow or spark is actually a result of this
Yes. It's like
putting
electricity.
up,
What
putting up
happens?
up, something like that.
So I think with this, I think we've sated ourselves at this first level. We will now move on to the next level. So all of you please. It was commissioned by the Mahendras, and this level often lends itself to this kind of cathedral-like space. And it's and therefore, even in terms of the exhibition sightlines, we felt that this Mumbai Proverbs 7 panels would work perfectly. A mural would work perfectly in this space. And we're also very happy to have this mural here, which is all thanks to Sudhir's art of persuasion, because otherwise the mural is locked up in the offices of the Mahendras, and people have to take an appointment to actually see your work. So here we're very happy to share this work with all of you. And Mumbai Proverbs, of course, as you can see, it's a mural which historicizes the city of Bombay. So you see the beginnings of the city from its colonial period with its colonial type of architecture, the Elphinstone College, Ornament Circle, and then of course you see its overbridges, its highways, you see the coming in of globalization, you see the milllands, the workers' solidarity getting fragmented, the mills being sold and turned into malls, down to this kind of speculative realism that we actually find in terms of how the city gets traded and bartered for money. So the important thing is in Mumbai Proverbs is actually also has also been triggered by Sudhir's love for Diego Rivera's mural, the Detroit mural. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the Detroit mural and the memory of that mural?
I think when the proposal for this commission came, I had never painted something this large, and immediately to my mind Rivera's murals came to mind, because those were things that I'd loved for a long time, and this was a chance to kind of work towards something like that. So in that, I mean, the central panel of this, which represents their automobile factory of the Mahendras in Kandivali, where I went and sketched and photographed and worked there. So that immediately relates to, of course, the Ford factory and things like that in the Detroit mural, but also the fact that from there were a few other influences that I must mention. One is, of course, the influence of Vinod Mukherjee's Indigo and mural. Now, at face value, it's a very different kind of mural, because it is actually about the saints, poets of India, and it's about rural life. So it's about the way in which life in rural India unfolds and the saints were. But what I took from that is a kind of flowing structure that could be something like a Japanese scroll, or like accordion book, something like that. So that comes, and I think Vinod also probably was influenced by Japanese art at that time. So structurally it draws from that, thematically it draws from this, as well as from Leger, whom I've always loved, and his work on the city. So all these different influences that all along when I was working on this painting on my laptop and on my computer, I had these three images of Leger's city, and the Rivera mural. So that's the kind of input, apart from the city itself, which is of course a major input. Like living in the city for 40 years, and all that. The way in which I painted the city in different ways, as a panorama from a distance, as a street level experience, and the insides of houses and factories and homes, and the outside, the city from outside, street level, all this. So bringing all this together and tying it up in a rhythm that was something like taking a train from Meti to Thana or something like that. So as you pass the train and you various suburbs unfold, the history of various suburbs unfold, you see the way in which the city has grown. So all this is somewhat, and there's a kind of negative comment at the end with this kind of depression, which is like, I mean, you have those buildings on top, postmodern architecture, which in Bombay is now sprouting in every suburb, in fact. And the fear that somewhere we are going to push down some part of our own lives, of our own citizens, of our own people living here who may not be able to claim citizenship to the city at some stage. So there's a kind of negative thing there. But generally it's a celebration, but it's also worrying about the city.
Yes. So it's interesting that you also brought in Vinod Bihari Mukherjee's Hindi Bhavan mural. We've often talked about how we've been influenced, especially by the way in which the saint figures in a way mingle with the people, with the everyday. But also, what you actually see is in the way in which the space has been configured. You have this kind of Diego Rivera kind of swirl, this wide-angle lens swirl, where the bridges and the bridges, the space, the interior space of the mall, and how in a way all these disparate spaces get connected, but again not as in a kind of in a poetic manner through a kind of flow, but through disruption, And what I also found fascinating is that what you call the negative aspect which you bring into it, it's basically it's like a shaft, which has actually gone into the earth. So you're tearing into the bowels of the earth because the city is constantly speculating and wants to make more money and is greedy. And in fact, for me, this is really an example of the post-industrial sublime. This kind of sense of horror that one feels. I think this is something that you've never really actually tried before, and so for me this detail is also extremely strong, because you have polluted effluence, for example in the Ulhasnagar work, or even before that in Nalla. But what you have here, definitely is an example of the post-industrial sublime. You really be able to take it one level further. And again, I don't know whether you agree with this or not, but for me this is very much like R.K. Lakshman's Common Man. This bald man who is looking at these rows and rows of assembly line, rows of computers, and then you have this anonymous figure who is actually changing the very nature of this city. So again, the way in which different generations of the city relate to its transformation. Again, this you suddenly see this acid green figure of from Toulouse Lautrec, So or again this man, again sort of disproportionate hand coming through. And what I also find fascinating is that, apart from your interest in the old masters and Chinese landscape painting and all those references, I think what you also do is that you're constantly relating to the media of your time. So whether it's a camera, or whether it's a camera which is used to make a selfie, or for instance, again these in the malls, the way in which you have surveillance cameras or trick mirrors. So I think you often use a lot of these elements also in your work. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So. It could be like a surveillance, a large surveillance camera or a satellite. You can read it in that way. So again, it's again to stress how this is not some simple documentation of reality. There's constant mediation that is going on. So therefore, for people who want to just look for evidentiary material in these paintings, be forewarned. There's much more to his work. And the moment we had Mumbai Proverbs here, the idea was to continue with the narrative of the city from different phases of Sudhir's works, but also, most importantly, what you have here to your left-hand side from this mural is riot. And the idea was to also talk about that moment in the history of the city when the city fell apart, when the collective fell apart and could not come together. So, Sudhir, would you like to talk about the riot?
I think 92 and post-92 period was an extremely difficult period. coming to terms with what had happened. And for a painter to be able to, or for a poet or anyone to write about things like that is extremely difficult, because one usually finds that it's very difficult to bring the same kind of horror that you have felt or that you have seen to your work. It's not easy at all. So it took me 4 years to actually get around to painting something on the riots. I did a lot of drawings, I did a lot of small prints and things like that around the theme, but I couldn't really, and even with this, it's as if maybe I can just metaphorically suggest the horror, and I cannot really paint the real thing that happened. So riot was the point at which Bombay, as Nancy said, started to fall apart. And since then, all these paintings in a sense are about community and the way in which communities no longer hold, the way in which doubt and shock, that painting is called shock, the way in which doubt will invade your perception of other people, of people around you, and which will kind of poison, will poison the relationship that you have with people. So this is the time of trying to, but my aim is not, throughout this period, my aim was not so much to show that things were falling apart, but trying to, through the painting, suggest that maybe there is still hope, maybe still people can hold on together. So please reflect that kind of
between the fact and between your desire for the hope for solidarity, exactly, for community formation and solidarity. And also, just these are little curatorial things which always give one pleasure. So the idea of putting this painting again in adjacency, or rather diagonally opposite to this work. So there's Riot, where you, of course, the center of the work is this deranged woman who's being attacked by people. And then you have Station Road, which is also, a work where you have, instead of the deranged woman here, you have a madman here. So again, through this kind of a visual narrative to help the viewer also see the works in a different light. So you have the deranged woman, the madman, and again you find that this is, again, all the figures are in extreme close-up. There's no perspectival depth. And interestingly, it's also, Sudhir has always loved to also render crowd scenes in a way that each member of the crowd looks distinct. That they are all coming together at some level, and yet they are very distinct, and they inhabit their own space. So on the one hand, as Sudhir said, there was this hope for people to come together despite this kind of communal disharmony. But on the other hand, this aberration, this having the figure of madness, which in a way disrupts the space, and then you have this woman who's sighing, or you have the limbs of all these people are very loose, and in a way they're coming in the way of each other. For instance, so it's almost like a dance which is created just through limbs, and the limbs invading each other's space. And of course, Sudhir was also thinking about the crowd scenes in Ajanta frescoes. So there are many of these references: Diego Rivera, Ajanta frescoes, and often, Sudhir, when I also look at your colors, again, people say, you meet many of these characters, or what they're wearing, you'd see them on the local train, but actually it's not, because sometimes, you suddenly see a Raphael green. Or you see, a yellow robe from Renaissance, for instance, But the way in which you're able to absorb all these different sources and influences, and then, sort of just blend them into your own constructive reality is something that I've always admired. Of course, as Sudhir said, shock, which is very important again to have here, because on the one hand you have something like this, which is quite monumental, 7 panels telling you all about the city, and then the idea was to break it up, the different moments in the city, and therefore you have shock here, and then again there we have some very strong works, with journeys, and also another work. Maybe we should go on to that side, and we'll just talk a little bit about that work, and then we'll try and do it a little faster. See an early work where again he's doing something similar. You have Street Corner, which is also a personal favorite. It's almost cinematic. the way in which you have all these different cells of this painting, different spaces, brought to life, and they are all simultaneously talking to you. So you have a woman who's singing, who's doing a riyaz. You have, you have a couple at the balcony. You have a woman who's, invested in domestic labor. You have people returning home, by bus, which in a way also then cuts through your view of the house. And then of course you have this very Marxist poet-like figure who I've always told Sudhir reminds me of, Dahake, Vasant Dahake, the Marathi poet. And again, as you can see, on the one hand, you feel as if you have access to this house, but on the other hand, the road in a way cuts through that access. So again, the idea is that, of course, you can look into somebody else's house, but you will never know the reality. You'll never know the inner reality of all those figures. And of course, again, many of these works, of this kind, remind you of miniature paintings. The simultaneity of, foci and actions happening. And this work, again, Sudhir, could you talk about that detail of the cowl figure?
Yeah, this part of it, the right side of it, I saw on a bus stand, and it was quite striking. These two figures, they happened to be photographing around in a bus stand in Pune, and suddenly my clicking and they're looking at me coincided, which is like uncomfortable for both. So that was there, and then it felt that the image was like, it was something that one could paint, but there was something lacking, and then all the time I was in that same process, looking at people who had been discharged from hospital and going back, people from the rural parts of Pune come into Pune to get admitted, and then many of them are discharged and they're half sick and half like. So journeys of different kinds, a person going back maybe. One of the titles that I had in mind was Discharge Against Medical Advice. So, it was those kinds of thoughts around me. So that's kind of, journeys always means various things for all of us. So that's.
But again, this figure could be just, this figure has a certain immediacy which comes from the everyday life, but
yes.
also could be from an old master's painting.
Yes, the fact that it's and it's draped in white. One would not have that kind of white in reality, but the fact that it is draped is kind of, suddenly an apparition that appeared in that,
yes.
which gives the whole thing a different kind of meaning.
Absolutely. Yeah. May I request all of you now to move on to the next level? Thank you for being with us on this journey. There are more levels actually to walk through. On this level, the idea was that we actually begin with the early works, which is from the late 70s, like Running Woman, and then juxtapose it with something from more recent times, 2012, Woman Holding a Plat, and then City Girl, 2012. And of course, the idea of putting these three women figures from different phases of Sudhir's oeuvre was also because I've always been fascinated by the way in which he actually draws the figure of the woman. In a way, it is very similar to which he draws the male figure, which is resilient, monumental, often Diego Rivera, like those Mexican murals where the body is inflated to fill up the whole space. And it's a resilient body despite all the trials and tribulations of life. And one thing that I found which is very fascinating, which I had never seen in a reproduction of this work, was the fact that the nose of this woman is actually broken. And again, this is something that you would never really see in a reproduction. And also, if you actually look at the painting, you find these blue stipples. So again, in Sudhir's work, apart from the theme, the content, the philosophical, aspects of his work, it's just also the rendering and again, this kind of blue, electric blue sari. And also, even in terms of the space, you might think that it's actually just flat, but it isn't, because below you again have another planar, introduction that comes in. And that twisted nose was actually quite strange for me, because again, it's like the derailment in Accident on May Day. There's always some derailment some distortion in your work, which it's almost like, I mean, here is a woman who's in the boxing ring of her life, and she's just had a blow, but she's running nevertheless. Or this woman, for instance, almost standing like a pillar, strong, and it's almost as if the plait is actually giving her anchorage in a world that otherwise falls apart too easily. Or the city girl, it's the shadow, which, it almost looks like an animal or something strange, again an aberration. And from that, I'd like to actually show you the Irani restaurant, which is a favorite painting of many, many people who love Sudhir's work. And this is again a joy to actually talk about this painting in my art criticism classes. And of course, students come up with absolutely beautiful and intriguing interpretations when you look at this work. So on the one hand, this is Irani restaurant. It's what generations of Mumbaiites are very familiar with, although the restaurant now has become quite extinct in our cityscape. And this was also the time, where in the late 70s, you would have the artists like Sudhir Patwardhan, but also filmmakers like Saeed Mirza, and activists coming together, sitting in an Irani cafe, and sitting actually side by side with workers. So the workers would order their bun maska, and there would also be the intellectuals, the artists, activists, having conversations. But what you find in this painting is that all the conversations are actually pushed into a reflection of the mirror. And instead what you have is again this monumental figure, just like running woman, in the foreground. And this figure, again, it's like, the figure is almost ghostly or like an aberration. Sort of this kind of gritty white figure, strange. Of course, Sudhir will say it's a figure that it's a person I actually saw sitting in the Bombay local. A figure that you actually saw. But when we look at the painting, again, there's almost something spectral about the figure. And, so it's a figure that comes to you from Mexican mural, but then he mediates it and turns it into something very different. And then when you look at, again, the way in which he treats the workers, the truckers, for instance, this is Dhaka from 1977. And again, if you look at the body, there are all these, it's like the skin is gritty, and you have these white calluses on the skin. But again, it's about the gesture. So whether it's a woman who's holding her plait, or whether it's the man who's actually bending to pick up this piece of cloth, there's always this kind of tensile strength in the way in which he portrays the figure. And that's something that you find over and over in his works. It's how he actually calibrates that gesture, and it's almost like a taut string. If it was more or less, it would fall apart. It's almost that. And we again won't go into every detail, but to orient you towards this level was works from the 70s about the laboring body. We actually go into the landmark exhibition Place for People, 1981. We have some wonderful archival material, the poster of this landmark exhibition. It was curated by 6 artists: Vivan, Navani, Gulam, Jogen, Sudhir Patwardhan, and Geeta Kapoor, the critic. And they wanted to move away from this kind of universal kind of symbolism of the progressive artist group. Where for them, man was always with a capital M, a universal man. But for the Place for People artists, they were looking at the politics of the local, the everyday, how the self is part of the collective. And from there you have all these iconic works, which we have as reproductions here. The train, a woman who's wearing a Nawari sari, and there will be the office goer, So all of these people are standing side by side and looking at art. And also their comments on the exhibition are also very interesting. Some are, what we would call quite tikha, satirical, some are funny, so you must actually see this particular archival intervention. And Sudhir, may I please?
Apologies first for not having the original painting here. It did not come from the museum. So these 3 reproductions, not actual size, somewhat smaller size than the real one. This is painted in 81. just before the textile strike. So a lot was happening politically around that period. So it represents a street play, as it is called. Some young activists of left orientation performing a street play, speaking on behalf of the workers, mill workers, and it's happening in South Bombay. There's the artist image watching this. It was a period when I was questioning things at various levels. One of the levels was what makes a middle class person commit himself to an ideology of another class. The philosophical answer, of course, is that it's not an ideology of another class, it's an ideology for a classless society. So one commits oneself to the idea of a classless society. But what drives many middle class people towards that? Idealism, of course, but also certain forces that may be driving you away from your own reality or your own self. You want to deny certain things in your past, and therefore you are driven to justify your actions by an identification with something else. So all ideas like that, feelings, ideas, because here is a bus in which there is a reflection which I modeled on my mother. So that's there, and this kind of reflection, as in many paintings of mine, things can be explained in terms of, yeah, this could be a reflection, this could be scientifically, optically explained, but it's there for another reason also. So it's like this because this is not really real. If this is real, then this is something like a reflection of the real. So that's the way in which.
Who's also doubtful, who is actually questioning the role of art in relationship to ideology. And again, what I find very admirable is about Sudhir's work is that he was doing this very early in his career. Often artists actually think about these questions of, especially Marxist artists, they think about it much later in their lives. But you were socialized in Marxism in the early 70s, and already in the early 80s, you were evaluating the role of art and ideology. And so having your presence here, looking at this street play, and again, as you said, this is a reflection. So again, it's not. I mean, it is the DN Road arcade, but then what you see here, the bus is actually ensconced within a reflection. And again, the way in which he divides the space. So you go from what visibly looks like DN Road to the mill lands, and when you look at the street play again, within the street play, one of the characters actually, his hands are outstretched, and they almost look like, a martyr. So again, going back to medieval Christian stories, you also have a faint cross here actually within the arcade. So again, Sudhir's love for the old master paintings and looking at what stigmata means, what violence means, what martyrdom means. So though that history of martyrdom from Christian lore, in a way, sort of being layered upon Halla Bol, like a street play happening on the streets of Bombay, don't forget, 82 is when you have the textile strike in Bombay, so this is 81, this is in the run-up to the textile strike already. So you have these workers who are almost walking out like prisoners. But then again, above you have this flutter of wings of birds, So it's a very complex work, like everything else that Sudhir does, and that's why one admires and respects him so much.
This figure actually comes from Piero della Francesca's Assisi cycle, story of the true cross. So I have lots of borrowings like that enter my work.
Yes. We won't go into yes. Bailen Saha is again a very important work, and in a way you can relate it to street play, and I'll explain why. Because on the one hand, you again feel that these are panels which talk about the city. You have this group of men. Again, you don't realize whether this is a man who's actually sinking, he's falling, or somebody is trying to hit him. The same kind of ambiguity. You have this lady with a child, and you're not sure whether this man just wants to, pet the child or wants to take the child away. And then you have these two scenes precariously, in a way, balancing on the lanes below. So again, the kinds of spatial, configuration that he's working on is very fascinating. And what you have here also is, when I first saw this work at the Sakshi Art Gallery, I looked at it and I asked Sudhir, again, this reminds me of, for example, the presentation of, the infant Christ, at the temple, or this reminds me of the deposition of Christ, Christ being taken down from the cross. And Sudhir said yes. It's not something that everybody would have noticed immediately, because there's nothing specifically, which would tell you that. But he immediately said yes. And Sudhir, can you also talk about the other references, that the Eisenheim altar and...
Well, I do see this as a kind of altarpiece, because the structure of it let me tell you how it started with a small sketch in my sketchbook of those three figures on the left, the old man and the woman and the child. And I knew for a long time that this sketch held something that it had something that could hold much larger connections, much larger context. So I was waiting.
Shante Singh, talk loudly.
So I was waiting for something to happen, and it took about 10 years, after which I had this sketch done, which was when I was doing a lot of images of street killings and violence and things like that. And then things started to fall in place. So there were multiple stories happening here. So that's why we call it bi-lanes, like multiple stories in lanes, different lanes. That is something, this is something, that small boy sitting there in the ground, and these two panels here. So the whole structure is like an altarpiece which has a Christ figure in the center and all the related stories around him. But here it is the Christ who's missing, there's no savior, and that's a kind of element, though you see the sky and you see the scaffolding, which could be something like a cross, but there is no savior here. So it's an image, it's a dark image in that sense, people going and coming, various things happening in the city, but that's how we see the city.
Yes. So yeah, it's exactly as Sudhir said. So the figure of the savior is missing, and therefore it's hope deferred.
Yeah. Yes.
And from this painting, I'd just like to again give you a little bit of introduction. We at Lalla, for instance, here, and you have this the intermixing of the landscape with the cityscape in this particular part of the space. And Lalla was made in 1985, so this is after Street Play and Train and all those works. And you already have, Sudhir, you'd already moved to Thane, right?
Yes.
By this time. So what is again very interesting about this work is that it has been sort of in a way treated like a miniature painting, where you have all these different little pockets and foci of actions which are simultaneously going on. And so you have these bare hills, so you already know that, the real estate developers, would like to quarry these hills to build the city further. And then what you have are these little everyday actions. So something very magical. You have this bare, bare mountains, and then you have this magical horse, who's being bathed. And then you suddenly have this figure of the nude. Which Sudhir says comes from Renoir, as he says, I've copied it from Renoir. So strange things are happening. On the one hand, you can see it as, as a city which is being transformed by real estate developers and speculators. But on the other hand, it's these little miraculous moments in the everyday. The nude. The person who is actually, planting something, near the tree. People who are just watching, and again, this particular Nalla, which is going through it. So I was downstairs, I was talking about the post-industrial sublime, and how Sudhir deals with, the industrial landscape. And here, it's again, it's this kind of dark blue water, which already tells you that, something is wrong with the water. It's chemical. It has a chemical hue. and yet, you have this nude in the middle of it. So again, each time you think that you know or understand what Sudhir is saying, something else, an action or a gesture tells you that there is more to what you are looking at. And this was, again, you have 85, by the late 80s. Sudhir, would you like to talk about how you wanted to actually go into the landscape or the cityscape and paint there, rather than within your studio?
Yeah, there was a period after I did this painting and then after I did in 85, 86, there was an area around Thana called Pokhran, which I used to go. We used to go on Sundays or other days, and it was very interesting because within a couple of kilometers you drive and you leave industry, you leave the highway, you leave the industry and small scale industries, and then you come up to a lake and you come up to some Adivasi settlements. So within that short period you could kind of traverse the whole kind of history of urbanization or something like that. So I started to paint in that region. I used to take my canvas out, and there are 4 paintings here from a series of about 20, 21, 22 paintings that I did in those 3 years. So I used to take my work out there. It was also a period when I had, after having made what to my mind were political works, where I was identifying with the people I was speaking about. After that period, I was seeking other ways in which to engage with society. And one of the ways in which I felt as an artist I needed to do is to make people understand what I was doing, what I was up to. And so painting on the spot was a means of allowing people to see a painting come to life. So, and then I had exhibitions of these paintings in those areas, in different parts, in schools, in factory sheds, in other kind of small things, where I would explain the difference between a photograph and a painting, what happens when one paints, and then where more paintings could be seen, where people could go and see more paintings and things like that. So it had this social kind of aspect to it, apart from the fact that I was extremely enjoying it. I had not done it since my days in Pune when I used to go out to paint landscape on the spot. After that I had not done that. I was always painting in the studio. So this again was kind of a refreshing way in which to connect with nature. César has always been on my mind throughout, sitting in front of the motif and actually translating one's sensations into paint has always been very important. So this was a period when I was doing that. You have some documentation, as Nancy said, of the shows that one had there. There are works like that which were not painted on the site, but which also were a result of painting in that area. The boy coming out of the lake.
And boy here has been shown alongside a very recent work made by Sudhir again, which is Cloud. And again, it was interesting to show boy with cloud, because you have this Cloud actually is an autobiographical work. It's basically young Sudhir, and it also reminds you of, for example, Ritvik Ghatak's film Subarna Rekha. Where you have these little children, walking on an abandoned airstrip, for instance. And again, the buildings, in the background are very sketchy. They're incomplete, which also is, and then you have this, this kind of, pall or kind of gloom, in the sky, in the form of a kind of dark, heavy cloud. And that, of course, is also a way of, talking about what lies in the future for this child. So I think, it's very interesting to see a boy which has this which is not autobiographical. It's another child, but which has a landscape which is reflective in a very different way from Cloud, which is also reflective, but which is also in a way of looking back at what your desires or aspirations were, and then what you sort of became. Yeah. But also one thing which was quite strange for me was that you actually have the child with the genoa, in Cloud. So would you like to say why would a Marxist artist who does not believe in religion, why would you put this child with the genoa in this painting?
I put him because that was me at that stage. And that's a simple fact. And what I find rather strange with our ways of thinking is that one needs to justify now that I am doing this even though I am a Marxist. But it's a question that is what, and all of us come from backgrounds that were essentially more or less religious, or we come from, we may or may not reject them at all. So we all have complex kind of backgrounds, and we have to live with the present and make the best of, what values came from those backgrounds to understand and to implement in the present. So to me, when I was actually doing it, it did not actually occur to me at all that there was any problem in painting it like that, because it was there and that was that. Also with the cow, for example, there were readings, what is that a cow? What is happening here? But in kind of hindsight, I might say that at times you need to understand the enemy from within, So you need to get back, you need to kind of project one's own things into what the enemy in a sense, maybe thinking from where does his thinking come. And if you have clues within yourself to understand that, then that might lead you to a better way of resolving the tensions between communities. I don't know.
So I think this is very relevant, the discussion that we are having, because all of us, I mean, we are ourselves are made up of multiple lineages, religious, ethnic, linguistic, and so forth. And we have to deal with what we were born with, and then also importantly, what we can become. So I think that this is also a journey about, the community that you're born into, with all its, merits and demerits, with everything that you can celebrate about it, but also, its prejudices, which then, later on become dangerous and actually lead to the kind of situations that we have seen in the last few years of our republic. So
I made that, I'd like to add here. I made that painting for an exhibition which Ranjit Hoskote was curating.
Yes.
When Ranjit was writing the book on me in 2004, he asked me whether we would like to, he asked me whether we would like to explore my Brahminical background. The fact of being a Chitpavan Brahmin in Pune, which is like the height of whatever. So would I like to explore that? And I actually was uncomfortable. And I said, no, that is something that I don't identify with. So I've kind of separated myself from that, and etc. So we didn't explore that at that time. But then when painting this work in response to Ranjit's curatorial note, maybe, I was not actually very consciously doing it, but maybe it came in because, okay, here Ranjit, this is your Brahmin boy.
A complicated Brahmin boy. And yes, I mean, a complicated lineage which we then deal with, and question and evaluate all the time. With Ranjit was also very interesting because, every act of either curation or writing is an act of also clarification. And I think clarification both for the artist and also for the writer and the curator. And I think that these are invisible processes which people don't necessarily see, because what you only see is what you find in the public prints, where the artist is just lionized and you only see the surface of her or his practice. But these are the unheard, invisible conversations that actually happen between the different contributors to the artwork. And with that now, we have this level, which actually deals with the industrial and post-industrial landscape in Sudhir's work. And we have, of course, this very iconic work, Lower Parel, where already this is a time when, while street play was done in the run-up to the textile strike in the 80s, here you have Lower Parel already where, globalization has happened, the mills have now, been exchanged for malls, and the workers have lost their jobs, their lives have been disrupted. Many of them, even their children often would actually become part of the Shiv Sena Shakhas. So the disruption of the workers' community, their lives, and what you have within the painting then capitalism and the workers' solidarity, but it's about, as Sudhir always does, he always philosophizes that moment. So it's also about the cycle of life. It's also about the cycle of capital, about the wheel of life, being changing. And actually the bridge is what, in a way, symbolizes that, and again, you have the crowd, which again comes from, frescoes, murals, other things that you have been looking at. And then you have this untitled work, where again you have this very picturesque cityscape, where you are stitching different parts of the city together. Now this is something that we've also seen in other works, but maybe we'll just concentrate on Ulhasnagar. Sudhir, would you like to talk a little bit about Ulhasnagar?
The area around Ulhasnagar and Ambernath fascinated me for many reasons. One of the reasons is that it was an already industrialized area. Ambernath had a lot of industry, and between Ambernath and Ulhasnagar, if one walked the rail track, one would see a lot of industry. But there was already a sense of decline in that industry. And some of it was leaving, some of it was not doing well, whatever. So this was in between 1995 and 2000 that I was working in that area, going regularly, doing sketches, doing drawings, and photographing. So Ulhasnagar, this particular bend in that river is something that has fascinated me from childhood. Whenever we used to come to Bombay from Pune or go back, that beautiful bend that the railway crosses, it evokes a lots of things. So in this painting, what I wanted in a sense to show was, of course, this particular bend and the life around it. So there are lots of power looms there, and there is, on one side you can see not yet urbanized area, and on the other hand a fully urbanized area. The third panel with the tall buildings is, when I painted it, was more or less imaginary, so there weren't any tall buildings at that time. Today I think there are many more going in that direction. And there is, again, as I said, with the Mumbai Works painting, this is much earlier of course, the passage of time from daytime, from early morning to evening, the passage of time across that, and the passage of a much larger time scale of pre-urban to post-industrial. So this is the kind of scale that I had in mind that I wanted to suggest through that work. And ultimately, of course, beyond everything else, it has to be a beautiful work. I mean, I keep coming back to the fact that paintings have to be beautiful. They have to be beautiful to look at. They must make you want to keep looking at them again and again. And so one of the ways in which one does that is to make them vessels in which all your feelings can still remain still and not overflow. So, as I said earlier, the polluted river, the polluted air, the urbanization that's going in ways that we are not happy with, and yet the early light, early morning light, the city that we enjoy, the city that, so all these conflicting feelings need to somehow settle at brim level in a work of art to make it beautiful. That's the kind of ideal that one works towards.
Even if the beauty is a terrible beauty, like the purple of this affluent and kind of bloodied purple of pollution.
Yes.
And you always have this slight aberration, like the broken nose or something spectral. So it is beautiful, and yet there is something terrifying, behind
like
it.
The famous Francis Bacon, he made it in a very different context.
Yeah.
But no beauty.
There's always something. Something that's out of whack or not harmonious about it.
Yeah.
And maybe with this we could move up, or would you like to talk a little bit about clearing?
No, I think
we can maybe perhaps, and then you can come down in
this.
Yes. Anji. Sabji. I've always enjoyed curating because it has this very using kind of slice and spin logic. This for me, as I've always called it, the sky of the exhibition, because you actually, come up all these various levels to reach here. And the idea was to create some coordinating axes within this dome, because it's a circular space, and therefore there is no beginning or end. But what you can have are constellations of works. So the first axis that I was creating was actually, these two works, rack and back, because I found these extremely strong works of Sudhir. The human figure, again, sort of, stretched, embattled, and also the way in which Sudhir lives. Sudhir, could you tell us a little bit about how you made rack and back?
Yeah, they were made with this large paper on the floor, and me bending down over it on my knees and using a very thick bar of charcoal to actually, so that it was like the figure was coming to life or happening under me. So I was bending over it and going at it as if I was being quite violent about it. So that is the way in which they took shape.
So the idea was to have these two charcoal works, and then to then connect them with two opposing axes. One is journeys, and the other is the aging artists, the aging pottering artists. And then on both sides of these axes, what you have is the artist in his studio, and then you also have his works, family works, alongside the journeys that he's taken in recent years, and also reflections on marital life. So these are the basic thematics that we actually deal with here. And here, what you have actually is encounters with time. So we have a projection here, because whenever I look at the series from the 80s, where you have these, we have both the encounters with time and classical self-figures. So these are the two series that we actually have projected in the dome. And encounters with time, it has these extremely spectral, strange, uncanny figures. So you could have an emperor, a courtier, kind of science fiction traveler, and for example, right here, as you can see. And as I suggested to Sudhir, that we should actually have a projection, and thank you for agreeing. So we have something magical happening in the dome. And then we just marry the enchantment of time along with the classical fairy figures. So again, the figure of the violin is done. It's going to become a reference to the old. So you have this little magical moment, when you look up. And the idea was that you're coming up. We already had a erase downstairs. You see this aging artist who's trying to erase the specters. And then we have, would you like to talk a little bit about the self-portrait? With a brush and camera.
Yeah, self-portraits are always something that artists like to attempt with varying degrees of success, because it depends on how much you want to reveal and how much you want to show, what kind of image of yourself you want to show. So standing in front of the mirror actually is a basic mode of doing the self-portrait, and it's been done over the ages. A lot of great art has come from it. Rembrandt, who just mentioned, one who's been the absolute master of the self-portrait, looking at himself in the mirror. When you look at Rembrandt, looking at himself in the mirror, there occurs a moment when that changes to you looking at yourself through Rembrandt. Now, how that happens, one doesn't know, but it's an experience that one has when looking at Rembrandt, that it changes, it makes you look at yourself. Now that is something that's been, that is, I think, one always thinks of that kind of thing. Now here, there are various levels. The mirror is one, and you're looking at yourself in the mirror. But you're also going to photograph this. So you're going to have a photograph of looking at yourself in a mirror. And you're going to use the photograph, and then you're going to return to the mirror for details. So you're going to work between these two images or representations to work out a third representation. Now, in these multiple kind of representations, your hope is that you will catch yourself somewhere. But inevitably, it's going to be floating between these representations. You will not be able to pin it down. But hopefully, the hope is that hopefully this exercise of trying to pin yourself down will kind of instigate some kind of self-reflection in people who also see it. So that's kind of thinking behind.
And also, it's how it's your commitment to expanding the very genre of realism itself. Because, for instance, you have Jyoti Bhai's photograph, which is kind of ethnographic portrait of a couple, Adivasi couple. And again, you have on the canvas again. I think you also have penthouse triangles. So again, you have these various symbols as floating signifiers, which again question and overturn the meaning of documented or documentarian reality. And then we've got, again, may or may not be a portrait, but basically of an old person sort of stumbling and falling. And alongside, the artists in the studio, maybe we should also talk about the abstractions, which is, you could just go into there and many other art students from JJ School of Art, even Navjot's, I believe. And Palshikar was, of course, quite authoritarian, and he believed in abstraction, as the only or the most dominant form of art making. And he, of course, Sudhir met him, when he'd already retired. But what I found fascinating about this work is that here you have somebody who, who this sort of, in a way, symbolizes the importance of abstraction. And you have him actually in his underclothes. Then you have something strange like a chatai or a carpet or something here. And you realize that he's just woken up from his afternoon siesta. And the abstraction that you actually see is in the reflection of the glass of the bookshelves. And this reflection itself is almost like a demon corn kind of painting when you look at it. And the reason why I also found this fascinating is, apart from the fact that there is, again, this little pile of carpet or chatai also is like something of the artist's subconscious, which is lying there on the floor. And Sudhir often has, whether it's dhakka, whether it's a towel on the floor, or bhaiya, where again you don't know whether it's underclothes or something that bhaiya is actually picking up from the floor. So you always have something, some intimate clothing, something that's very close to the body, which you'll find on the floor. And the reason why I was smiling when I looked at this work is that because I've often heard, especially women artists, talking about how Palshikar was very authoritarian, and he often did not take to women artists because, naturally women artists would want to express their own independence in their work. And here you find him, sort of almost sort of in his everyday avatar, still looking very self-determined and kind of strict disciplinarian. And maybe Sudhir, you could talk a little bit about this JJ, sort of debate about abstraction.
My relationship with Palshikar was very, like one could say, that very close. We stayed in Thana, we were close to where he stayed. He came often to the studio. He liked my work very much. And I learned a lot about painting from him. But there was this one thing that he used to say, that since he liked my work and since he found that my work was good, that inevitably it would progress towards abstraction. Because that was the mode in which good artists actually move. And so this was a kind of answer. I did it after he passed away, but this was a kind of answer. He's sitting there looking at an abstract drawing, but that is reality for me, the way in which I paint it. And I see as much abstraction in that reality as there is in this. So there is no sharp line that I can draw between abstraction and realism. It's the way in which you relate to it, the way in which you see this. So it's a kind of light-hearted answer to the Guru.
Yeah, I find it extremely fascinating work, especially when you look at it in terms of pedagogy of different schools of art. And although you did not go to JJ, but because you came to Bombay, then you inevitably became part of these debates related to
It's interesting. I think I value that someone held this view, because it makes you look at abstraction with much greater kind of, you want to probe it much more. Right? Does it really stand to this? And the best abstraction actually does. So there's a lot that any painter can learn from the way in which abstract art is progressed, and in which, so apart from the historical reality, apart from the historical cycle through which abstraction and realism will go and will continue to go, apart from that, this concentration on language, like Akbar for example, this concentration on language that abstraction insists on. You want, whatever you want to say through line, color, texture, form, nothing else. So that makes you more conscious that yes, I can't leave that, I can say whatever I want, but that has to be in place. So that's the kind of...
Yeah, and it's very important what you brought up right now, which is the formal properties are as important as what you want to say.
Absolutely.
So on the one hand, of course, you are exposing the social inequalities. You are looking at the structural violence of society, but you never let go of the affective traces, the sensorial traces. So therefore, again, it's not just what you see outside the window, but it's actually the reflection of that reality in the glass. And as you correctly pointed out, and in fact in your own work, your realism is constantly becoming abstract at the edges, or even in the foreground. In Irani Cafe, the man who's sitting there is actually spectral. So for example, that work again in Journeys, which is again a 2000s work, where you have the double reflection of the figure. So blurring, smudging, aberrations. These are very much been part of your, of your vocabulary. So that's why I thought it's important for us to discuss this, because this opens out the debate. And again, to the kinds of problems that actually we need in everyday, that we suffer through in everyday life, but also questions related to sexuality. For example, you have a work like Hermaphrodite, where you have this almost Ardhanarishwar figure, where one of the breasts is smudged out. Or you have an old woman who almost looks like she belongs to the third gender. And then you have the Kabal, which is my favorite work, again without using any language, just this performative gesture is so brilliant. That's why I always get angry when people say, oh, but when you go into an exhibition of paintings, everything is so quiet, actually you need to put up an interview with the artist talking about the work. And I said, no, the painting also has its own sonic resonances, and that is something that you have to commune with. You don't again need, we already have so many interfaces, visual interfaces. You don't need one more interface, because sometimes a painting can make a huge sound, it can create music, but you have to have the power of your imagination to be able to receive that. So along with sexuality and the kinds of stresses and strains that the body actually faces, I thought we would also have one constellation just on water, because I've always found it very fascinating how Sudhir deals with water in his work. So water in terms of the flooding in Thane, which he and his wife actually faced. When was this? The floods in Thane? Yeah, 92, early 90s. So that's when he made these works on flood. He and his wife also, their house was flooded. So their house was flooded and they had to deal with the situation. So it was a personal issue of course, but also how he was looking at his neighbors, salvaging their belongings, etc. And again, when you look at this figure, the figure reminds you of the figure in the cafe, So there are all these kind of ghosts and shadows of other figures. Shh! Please, lend me your ears. So the floods, so there's a kind of, one would not say natural, but a man-made calamity, as we say. There's that, but there's also this very archetypal, relationship with water, so source, So that's why I wanted to put these works together. Water is also the seat of, it's a site of the unconscious. So you have that, and then again here, you have bathers. And my favorite work is the pink one, of this man wading. So, I mean, again, like classical music, there are different kinds of ragas that you can actually hear from Sudhir's works. And, then sort of looking at water, at the disruptions of water, to its kind of archetypal renewing properties, to Nagrik. Nagrik is the most recent work that Sudhir has done. And in fact, it was a work that he did in the run-up to the retrospective. And here you have these 4 figures who have started floating, levitating about the cityscape. And again, this is a very quiet work. As I would say, when you look at this work, you almost feel a sense of terror. There's a sense of stillness, because if you see all the people here, they are either watching TV quietly, or somebody sleeping, resting, even the gunny bags are all quiet and tied up, they're mute. Again, the cityscape is kind of is made in an echelon manner with all these different planar disruptions in it. And then these 4 figures. Earlier, Sudhir had said that he wanted to call this painting 4 Dwellers. Then he called me up and said, no, I'm calling it Nagrik. Now, this work was made before the protests against the CAA. And I think Nagrik is something that's, of course, the notion of citizenship, it has always been very important for Sudhir in his work, right from the very beginning. And of course, it would be as a Marxist, But here, as you can see, these figures are levitating, but when you look carefully, they are also trying to find a purchase. So although there are glass cars and roof tiles, of the old time and the new, they are trying to actually get a toehold. They are not giving up their Nagrikhood. They are not giving up their citizenship. So, on the one hand, you could see it as 4 figures trying to transcend their everyday, but on the other hand, you could see that they are transcending, but they are not giving up the questions of political freedom. And then, and this is a painting that slowly unravels and opens. So you have these 3 figures, and then you have the 4th figure with his hand on his chest. And from his head, you have these Platonic solids suddenly opening out. So at the first level, I talked about philosophical idealism in his work, the Penrose Triangle. So here you have the Platonic solids, again symbolizing the ideal world, perfection. So here you have people, who are restive, they are trying to find a toehold within the city, and on the other hand, you have this kind of ideal space, the space of consciousness, of a new consciousness, hopefully. But even that, the way you can see it, he's not just sort of, he's not sort of turning it into some kind of a rhetoric trope. It's not a loud thing, because the Platonic solids also get camouflaged in the roof tiles and the walls. And and that's the beauty of Sudhir's art. Without making any noise, with extreme moderation and calibration, just like a musician, he's able to draw your attention to that which is important. And then again, if you see here, you have the Arabian Sea. And again, even within the boat, you have a house, which is sort of bobbing on the harbor. There are many more things that we can talk about in this painting, but perhaps we should, would you just like to say a little bit about just this work?
The last one?
Yeah, you can talk about either the last one or this. You choose. That will be the last note.
The last one. The last one.
This painting has the long title, construction worker washing her face. If you look at it, I don't think she looks very much like a construction worker, but the fact is that I saw a woman, a construction worker, while passing in an auto near a construction site, doing just that, doing this. And we talked about gesture earlier, and Nancy said about bending down and touching something. I think gestures have great potential to evoke meanings far beyond their immediate purpose. So you're washing your face, your hands are like that near your face, but that gesture may evoke a whole range of meaning. Someone bending down, someone bending to a side, someone touching someone. Any of this has wide kind of. So this gesture of a woman washing her face evoked for me many things. Also it evoked for me, for example, things I had seen in film, for example, a woman in great grief, things that I had seen in Anju Doria's painting when she had painted a similar woman. So it evokes various things in art, in life, in various situations. And then the aim is to then reach a formulation which is, in that sense, as I said earlier, beautiful. Beautiful in the sense that it is blemish without blemish, in that sense. Ranjit thought that the red of the scarf is a vermeer, like a vermeer. So that, and the purpose of that non-blemished or perfect kind of rendition is to be able to hold these multiple kind of meanings within the gesture.
And I think with that moment of grace, we say thank you so much for being with us through this entire journey. Thank you.